Hi everyone, it's Beth here from the Yard, and today I'm going to carry on reading Six of Crows for you all. So we are on chapter 38, and that is Kaz. 11 bells and 3/4 chime. Kaz had considered trying to eavesdrop on Matthias and Brum in the ballroom, but he didn't want to lose sight of Nina when there were so many Driscoll around. He gambled on Matthias's feelings for Nina, but he'd always liked those odds. The real risk had been in whether or not someone as honest as Matthias could convincingly lie to his mentor's face. Apparently, the Fijian had hidden skills. Kaz had tracked Nina and Brum across the grounds to the treasury. Then he'd taken cover behind an ice sculpture and focused on the miserable task of regurgitating the packets of Wyland's root bombs he'd swallowed before they'd ambushed the prison wagon. He'd had to bring them up, along with the pouch of chloropellets and an extra set of lockpicks he'd forced down his gullet in case of an emergency. Every other hour to keep him from digesting them, it hadn't been pleasant. He'd learnt the trick from an East Stave magician with a fire-breathing act that had run for years before the man had accidentally poisoned himself by ingesting curacao. Once Kaz was done, he'd let himself check the treasury perimeter, the roof, the entry, but eventually there was nothing for him to do but keep hidden, stay alert, and worry about all the things that might be going wrong. He remembered Inej standing on the embassy roof, aglow with some new fervour that he didn't understand, but could still recognise. Purpose. It had suffused her with light. I'm taking my share, and I'm leaving the dregs. When she talked about leaving Kurdistan before, he'd never quite believed her. This time was different. He'd been hidden in the shadows of the western colonnade when the bells of Black Protocol began to ring, the chimes of the elder clock booming over the island, shaking the air. Lights from the guard towers came on in a bright flood. The Driscoll around the ash let off their rituals, and they began shouting orders, and a wave of guards descended from the towers to spread out over the island. He'd waited, counting the minutes, but there was still no sign of Nina or Matthias. They're in trouble, Kaz had thought. Or you were dead wrong about Matthias, and you're about to pay for all of those talking tree jokes. He had to get inside the treasury, but he'd need some kind of cover while he picked that inscrutable lock, and there were Driscoll everywhere. Then he saw Nina, and Matthias, and a person he assumed was Boyle Bayer, running from the treasury. He'd been about to call out to them when the explosion hit, and everything went to hell. They blew up the lab, he'd thought, as debris rained down around him. I definitely did not tell them to blow up the lab. The rest was pure improvisation, and it left little time for explanation. All Kaz had told Matthias was to meet him by the ash when Black Protocol began to ring. He'd thought he'd have time to tell them to deploy the Baleen before they were all falling through the dark. Now he just had to hope that they wouldn't panic and that his luck was waiting somewhere below. The fall seemed impossibly long. Kaz hoped the sure boy he was holding on to was a surprisingly young Boyle Bayer, and not some hapless prisoner Nina and Matthias had decided to liberate. He'd shoved the disc into the boy's mouth as they went over, snapping it with his own fingers. He gave the whip a flick, releasing all of the cables, and heard the others scream as the strands retracted. At least they wouldn't go into the water bound. Kaz waited as long as he dared to bite into his own baleen. When he struck the icy water, he feared his heart might stop. He wasn't sure what he'd expected, but the force of the river was terrifying, flowing fast and hard as an avalanche. The noise was deafening, even beneath the water, but with fear also came a giddy vindication. He'd been right. The voice of God. There was always truth in legend. Kaz had spent enough time building his own myth to know. He'd wondered where the water that fed the ice court's moat and fountains came from, why the river gorge was so very deep and wide. As soon as Nina had described the Driscoll initiation ritual, he'd known. The Fijian stronghold hadn't been built around a great tree, but around a spring. Djel, the wellspring, who fed the seas and rains and the roots of the sacred ash. Water had a voice. It was something every canal rat knew. Anyone who had slept beneath a bridge or weathered a winter storm in an overturned boat. Water could speak with the voice of a lover, a long-lost brother, even a god. That was the key. And once Kaz recognised it, it was as if someone had laid a perfect blueprint over the ice core and its workings. If Kaz was right, Gel would spit them out into the gorge, assuming they didn't drown first. And that was the very real possibility that Beline had provided enough air for 10 minutes, maybe 12, if they could keep calm, which he doubted they would. His own heart was hammering, and his lungs already felt tight. His body was numb and aching from the temperature of the water, and the darkness was impenetrable. There was nothing but the dull thunder of the water and a sickening sense of tumbling. He hadn't been sure of the speed of the water, but he knew damn well those numbers were close. Numbers had always been his allies. Odds, margins, the art of the wager. But now he had to rely on something more. What god do you serve? Inej had asked him. Whichever will grant me good fortune. Fortunate people didn't end up racing arse over tea kettle beneath an ice moat in hostile territory. What would be waiting when they fished up in the gorge? Who would be waiting? Jesper and Wyland had managed to engage Black Protocol, but had they managed to do the rest? Would he see Inej on the other side? Survive? Survive? Survive. It was the way he'd lived his life, moment to moment, breath to breath, since that terrible morning when he'd woken to find that Geordie was still dead and he was still very much alive. Kaz tumbled through the dark. He was colder than he'd ever been. He thought of Inej's hand on his cheek. His mind had gone jagged at the sensation, a riot of confusion. It had been terror and disgust, and in all of that clamour, desire, a wish that lingered still, the hope that she would touch him again. When he was 14, Kaz had put together a crew to rob the bank that helped the Herzoon prey on him and Geordie. His crew got away with 50,000 krug, but he'd broken his leg dropping down from the rooftop. The bone didn't set right, and he limped ever after. So he found himself a fabricator and had his cane made. It became a declaration. There was no part of him that was not broken, that had not healed wrong, and there was no part of him that was stronger for having been broken. The cane became a part of the myth he built. No one knew who he was. No one knew where he came from. He'd become Kaz Brecker, cripple and confidence man, bastard of the barrel. The gloves were his one concession to weakness. Since that night among the bodies and the swim for the Reaper's barge, he had not been able to bear the feeling of skin against skin. It was excruciating to him, revolting. It was the only piece of his past that he could not forge into something dangerous. The baleen began to bend around his lips, water seeping in. How far had the river taken them? How far did they have left to go? He still had one hand gripped around Boyor Bayer's collar. The shoeboy was smaller than Kaz. Hopefully he had enough air. Bright flashes of memory sparked through Kaz's mind. A cup of hot chocolate in his missing hands. Geordie warning him to let it cool before he took a sip. Ink drying on the page as he signed the deed to the Crow Club. The first time he'd seen Inej at the menagerie, in purple silk, her eyes lined with kohl. The bone-handled knife he'd given her. The sobs that had come from behind the door of her room at the Slat the night she'd made her first kill. The sobs he ignored. Kaz remembered her perched on the sill of his attic window, sometime during that first year after he'd brought her into the dregs. She'd been feeding the crows that congregated on the roof. You shouldn't make friends with crows, he told her. Why not? She asked. He looked up from his desk to answer, but whatever he'd been about to say had vanished on his tongue. The sun was out for once, and Inej had turned her face to it. Her eyes were shut, her oil-black lashes fanned over her cheeks. The harbour wind had lifted her dark hair, and for a moment Kaz was a boy again, sure that there was magic in this world. Why not? She repeated, eyes still closed. He said the first thing that popped into his head. They don't have any manners. Neither do you, Kaz, she laughed, and if he could have bottled the sound and got drunk on it every night, he would. It terrified him. Kaz took a last breath as the baleen dissolved and the water flooded in. He squinted against the rush of the water, hoping to see some hint of daylight. The river knocked him against the wall of the tunnel. The pressure in his chest grew. I'm stronger than this, he told himself. My will is greater. But he could hear Geordie laughing. No, little brother. No one is stronger. You've cheated death too many times. Greed may do your bidding, but death serves no man. Kaz had almost drowned that night in the harbour, kicking hard in the dark, borne aloft by Jodie's corpse. There was no one and nothing to carry him now. He tried to think of his brother, of revenge, of Pekka Rollins tied to a chair in the house of Sleverstrap, trade orders stuffed down his throat as Kaz forced him to remember Geordie's name. But all he could think of was Inej. She had to live. She had to have made it out of the ice court. And if she hadn't, then he had to live to rescue her. The ache in his lungs was unbearable. He needed to tell her. What? That she was lovely and brave and better than anything he deserved. That he was twisted, crooked, wrong, but not so broken that he couldn't pull himself together into some semblance of a man for her. That without meaning to, he began to lean on her, to look for her, to need her near. He needed to thank her for his new hat. The water pressed at his chest, demanding that he part his lips. I won't, he swore. But in the end, Kaz opened his mouth and the water rushed in. Part 6. Proper Thieves. Chapter 39. Inej. Inej's heart careened against her ribs. On the aerial swings, there was a moment when you let go of one and reached for the next. When you realised you'd made a mistake and you no longer felt weightless, when you simply started to fall. The guards hauled her back through the prison gate. There were many more guards and many more guns pointed at her than the first time she'd come through this courtyard. When she stepped off the prison wagon with the rest of the crew, they passed through the mouth of the wolf and up the stairs, and dragged her down the walkway through the corridor with its giant glass enclosure. Nina had translated the banner for her, for Jern might. She smirked at that the first time she passed, gazing down at the tanks and weapons, one eye on Kaz and the others on the opposite walkway. She'd wondered what kind of men needed to display their strength to help lift captives in chains. The guards were moving too fast. For the second time that night, Inej made herself stumble. Move, the soldier snapped in Kerch, dragging her forward. You're going too quickly. He gave her arm a hard shake. Stop stalling. Don't you want to meet our inquisitors? The other asked. They'll get you talking. But you won't look so pretty after they're through. They laughed, and Inej's stomach turned. She knew they'd spoken in Kerch to make sure she understood. She thought she might be able to take them, despite their guns and even without her knives. Her hands weren't bound, and they still thought they had the disgraced prostitute on their hands. Helene had called her a criminal. But to them, she was only a little thief in scraps of purple silk. Helene had caught, she was just as considering making her move. She heard other footsteps. She heard other footsteps headed their way. She saw the silhouettes of two more men in uniform striding towards them. Could she manage 4 guards on her own? She wasn't sure. Could she get them out of her way? She wasn't sure. But she knew that if they left this corridor behind, it was all over. She glanced again at the banner in the glass enclosure. It was now or never. She hooked her leg around the ankle of the guard to her left. He pitched forwards, and she slammed her hand upwards, breaking his nose. The other raised his gun. You're going to pay for that. You won't shoot me. You need information. I can shoot you in the leg, he sneered, lowering his rifle. Then he crumbled to the ground, a pair of beaten-up shears protruding from his back. The soldier behind him gave a cheery wave. Jasper, she gasped in relief. Finally. I'm here too, you know, said Wylan. The guard with the broken nose moaned from the floor and tried to lift his gun. Inej gave him a good hard kick to the head. He didn't move again. Did you manage to get hold of a big enough diamond? Jasper asked. Inej nodded and slipped the massive jewel choker from her sleeve. Hurry, she said. If Helene hasn't noticed it's missing, she will soon. Though with Brack's protocol in effect, there wasn't much she could do about it. Jasper snatched the choker from Inej's hand, mouth agape. Cass said we needed a diamond. He didn't tell you to steal Helene Van Hooden's diamonds. Just get to work. Cass had given Inej 2 objectives. Nab a big enough diamond for Jasper to work with and get herself into the corridor after 11 bells. There were plenty of other diamonds she could have stolen for their purposes, and other trouble she could have made to attract the guards' attention. But it was Helene she'd wanted to dupe. For all the secrets she'd gathered, and documents she'd stolen, and violence she'd done, it was Helene Van Hooden she'd needed to best. And Helene had made it easy. During the scuffle in the rotunda, Inej had made sure that she was too focused on being choked to worry about being robbed. After that, all of Helene's attention had been devoted to gloating. Inej only regretted that she couldn't be there to see Tante Helene discover her prize necklace was missing. Jasper lit a lantern and went to work beside Wylan. Only then did she see they were both covered in soot from their trip back down the prison incinerator shaft. They'd dragged 2 grubby coils of rope with them too. While they worked, Inej barred the doors set into the arches on either side of the corridor. They had just a few minutes before another patrol came through and discovered a door that shouldn't be locked. Wylan had produced a long metal screw and what looked like a handful of massive winch, and was attempting to rig them together to form what Inej hoped would be an ugly but functional drill. A thump came from one of the doors. Hurry, Inej said. Saying that doesn't usually make me want to work faster. Jasper complained as he concentrated on the stones. If I just break them down, they'll lose their molecular structure. They have to be cut. Carefully, the edges assembled into a single perfect drill bit. I don't have the training. Whose fault is that? Put in Wylan, not looking up from his own work. Again, not helpful. Now the guards were pounding on the door. Across the enclosure, Inej saw men storming onto the other walkway, pointing and shouting. But they couldn't very well shoot through 2 walls of bulletproof glass. The glass was Grisha made. Nina had recognised it as soon as they passed through the display. Fajr might be protected by Grisha's skill, and the one thing harder than fabricated glass was diamond. The doors on both sides of the walkway were rattling now. They're coming, Inej said. Wylan secured the diamond bit to make a makeshift drill. It made a scraping sound as they placed it up against the glass, and Jasper began turning the handle. The progress was painfully slow. Is it even working? Inej cried. The glass is thick. Something smashed into the door on their right. They have a battering ram, Wylan moaned. Keep going, urged Inej. She toed off her shoes. Jasper turned the crank faster as the drill bit whirred. He began to move in a curving line, sketching the beginnings of a circle, then a half moon. Faster. The wood of the door at the end of the walkway started to splinter. Take the handle, Wylan, Jasper shouted. Wylan took his place, turning the drill as fast as he could. Jasper grabbed the fallen guard's guns and pointed them at the door. They're coming, he yelled. On the glass, the 2 lines met. The moon was full. The circle popped free, tipping inwards. It hadn't even struck the floor because Inej was backing up. Out of the way, she demanded. Then she was running, her feet light, her silks like feathers. In this moment she didn't mind them. She duped Helene van Houten. She'd taken a little piece of her away, a silly symbol, but one she prized. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was a beginning. There would be other boors to trick, slavers to fool. Her silks were feathers, and she was free. Inez focused on that circle of glass, a moon, an absence of moon, a door to the future. As she leaped, the hole was barely big enough for her body. She heard the soft swish as the sharp glass rim sliced through the silks as she trailed. She arced her body and reached. She wouldn't have only opportunity to grab the iron lantern that hung from the ceiling of the enclosure. It was an impossible leap, a mad leap, but she was once again her father's daughter, unbound by the rules of gravity. She hung in the air for a terrifying moment, and then her hands grasped the lantern's base. Behind her, she heard the door in the walkway burst open. Gunfire. Hold them off, Jesper. Buy me time. She swung back and forth, building momentum. A bullet zinged past her. Accident? Or had someone made it past Wylan and Jesper to shoot at her through the hole? When she had enough momentum, she let go. She hit the wall hard. There was no graceful way around it, but her hands clung to the lip of the stone ledge where their ancient axes were displayed. From there it was easy. Ledge to beam, to lower ledge, and down with a dull clang as her bare feet struck the roof of the massive tank. She slid into the metal dome as its center. She turned one knob, then the next, trying to find the right controls. Finally, one of the guns rolled upwards. She pulled the trigger, and her whole body shook as bullets rattled against the enclosure glass like hail, pinging off in all directions. It was the best warning she could offer Jesper and Wylan. Inez could only hope she could get the big gun working. She wriggled down in the cockpit of the tank. She rotated the only visible handle, and the nose of the long gun tilted into place. The lever was there, just as Jesper had said it would be. She gave it a hard pull. There was a surprisingly small click. Then for a long, horrible moment, nothing happened. What if it isn't loaded? She thought. If Jesper's right about this gun, then the Fajers will be fooled to keep this much firepower just lying around. A thunk sounded from somewhere in the tank. She heard something rolling towards her and had the terrifying thought that she'd done it wrong. The mortar was going to roll right down into that long barrel and explode in her lap. Instead, there was a hissing sound and a shriek like metal grinding against metal. The big gun vibrated. A skull-rattling boom split the air with a puff of dark grey smoke. The mortar struck the glass, shattering it into thousands of glittering pieces, prettier than diamonds. Inez marvelled, hoping that Wylan and Jesper had found time and space to take cover. She waited for the dust to clear. Her ears were ringing badly. The glass wall was gone. All was still. Then 2 ropes attached to the walkway rails swung down, and Wylan and Jesper followed. Jesper like a limber insect, Wylan in stops and starts, wiggling like a caterpillar, trying to make its way out of a cocoon. Azure! Inez shouted in Fajer. Nina would be proud. She cranked the gun around, on the other side of the remaining glass wall, where men were shouting from the walkway. As the barrel swiveled in their direction, they scattered. Inez heard footsteps and clanging as Jesper and Wylan climbed onto the tank. Jesper's head appeared, hanging down from the dome. You letting me drive? If you insist. She moved aside so he could climb behind the controls. Oh, hello, darling, he said happily. He pulled another lever, and the armoured wagon seemed to shudder to life. Around them belching black smoke. What kind of monster is this? Inez wondered. That noise, she cried. That engine, cackled Jesper. Then they were moving, and not a horse in sight. Gunfire sounded from above. Apparently Wylan had found the controls. For saint's sake, Jesper said to Inez, help him aim. She squeezed in next to Wylan in the dome turret and aimed the second small gun, helping to lay down cover as the guards burst into the enclosure. Jesper was turning the tank, backing up as far as possible. He fired the big gun once. The mortar smashed the enclosure glass, sailed past the walkway, and struck the ring wall behind it. White dust and shards of stone scattered everywhere. He fired again. The second mortar hit hard, cracks splintering through the rock of the wall. Jesper had made a dent in the ring wall, a sizable one, but not a hole. "Ready?" he called. "Ready." Inej and Wylan replied in unison. They ducked beneath the gun turret. Wylan had scratches from the glass all over his cheeks and neck. He was beaming. Inej grabbed his hands and squeezed. They'd come to the ice court like scurrying rats. Live or die. They were going out like an army. Inej heard a loud thunk, the plunk and clangs of gears turning. The tank roared. The sound was thunder trapped in a metal drum, clamouring to be let out. It rolled back on its treads, then scourged forwards. They charged ahead, building momentum, faster and faster. The tank jounced. They must be out of the enclosure. "Hold tight," shouted Jesper, as they slammed into the ice court's legendary impenetrable wall with a jaw-shattering crash. Inej and Wylan flew back against the cockpit. They were through. They rumbled over the road, the snatter and pop of rifle fire fading behind them. Inej heard a chuffing noise. She righted herself and looked up. Wylan was laughing. He'd pushed out the niche of the dome and was looking back at the ice court. When she joined him, she saw the hole in the ring wall, a dark blot in all of that white stone, men running through, firing futilely at the tank's dusty wake. Wylan clutched his middle, still snorting laughter, and pointed downwards. Trailing behind them was a banner, caught in the tank's treads. Despite the smears of mud and the gunpowder burns, Inej could still make out the words, "Vjern might." Chapter 40. Nina. They emerged from the darkness, soaked, bruised, and gasping in the bright light of the moon. Nina's entire body felt as if it had been pummeled. The remnants of the baleen clustered in sticky gobs at the corner of her mouth. Her dress had frayed to nearly nothing, and if she hadn't been so desperately, giddily happy to be alive and breathing, she might have worried about the fact she was standing barefoot and practically naked in the gorge of a northern river, still a mile and a half from the harbour and safety. In the distance she could hear the bells of the ice court ringing. Kawhi was coughing water, and Matthias was dragging a limp, unconscious Kaz out of the shallows. "Saints, is he breathing?" asked Nina. Matthias flipped him onto his back, none too gently, and started pressing down on his chest with more force than was strictly necessary. "I should let you die," Matthias muttered in time with his compressions. Nina crawled over the rocks and kneeled beside them. "Let me help before you crack his sternum. Does he have a pulse?" She pressed her fingers to his throat. "It's there, but it's fading. Get his shirt open." Matthias helped tear the Driscoll uniform away. Nina placed one hand on Kaz's pale chest, focusing on his heart and forcing it to contract. She used the other to pinch his nose shut and push his mouth open as she tried to breathe air into his lungs. More skilled corporal-like could extract the water themselves, but she didn't have time to fret over her lack of training. "Will he live?" Kawhi asked. "I don't know." She pressed her lips to Kaz's again, timing her breaths with the beats she demanded of his heart. "Come on, you rotten barrel thug. You've fought your way out of tougher scrapes." She felt the shift when Kaz's heart took over its own rhythm. Then he coughed, chest spasming, water spewing from his mouth. He shoved her off of him, sucking in air. "Get away from me," he gasped, wiping his gloved hand over his mouth. Kaz's eyes were unfocused. He seemed to be staring right through her. "Don't touch me." "You're in shock, Jemdin," Matthias said. "You almost drowned. You should have drowned." Nina nodded slowly. "You drowned." "Ice court, remember?" Impossible heist? Near death? 3 million crew waiting for you in Rotterdam? Kaz blinked as his eyes cleared. 4 million? I thought that might bring you around. He scrubbed his hands over his face, wet cough still rattling in his chest. We made it, he said in wonder. Gel performs miracles. You don't deserve miracles, said Matthias with a scowl. You deserve a desecrated the sacred ash. Kaz pushed to his feet, staggering slightly, drew in another shaky breath. It's a symbol, Helva. If your god is so delicate, maybe you should get a new one. Let's get out of here. Nina threw up her hands. You're welcome, you ungrateful wretch. I'll thank you when we're aboard the Furlind. Move. He was already dragging himself up the boulders that lined the far side of the gorge. You can explain why our illustrious shoe scientist looks like one of Wyland's school plows along the way. Nina shook her head. Caught between annoyance and admiration, maybe that was what it took to survive in the barrel. You could never stop. He's a friend? Asked Kuei in skeptical shoe. On occasion. Matthias helped her to her feet, and they all followed after Kaz, making slow progress up the rocky walls of the gorge that would lead them to the other end of the bridge above, and a bit closer to Joelholm. Nina had never been so exhausted, but she couldn't let herself rest. They had the prize. They'd got further than any crew. They'd blown up a building at the heart of the ice court, but they'd never make it to the harbour without Inej and the others. She kept moving. The only other option was to sit down on a boulder and wait for the end. A rumbling began from somewhere in the direction of the ice court. Oh, saints, please let that be Jesper, she pleaded as they pulled themselves over the lip of the gorge and looked back at the bridge, festooned with ribbons and ash boughs for Hingrella. Whatever it is, it's big, said Matthias. What do we do, Kaz? Wait, he said as the sound grew louder. How about take cover? Nina asked, bouncing nervously from foot to foot. Have heart. I stashed 20 rifles in this convenient shrubbery. Give us something. How about a few million crew? Said Kaz. A tank rumbled over the hill, dust and gravel spewing from its treads. Someone was waving to them from its gun turret. No, two someones. Inej and Wyland were yelling and gesturing wildly from behind the dome. Nina let out a victorious whoop as Matthias stared in disbelief. When Nina looked at Kaz, she couldn't quite believe her eyes. Saints, Kaz, you actually look happy. Don't be ridiculous, he snapped. But there was no mistaking it. Kaz Brecker was grinning like an idiot. I'm assuming we know them? Asked Kuei. But Nina's elation dimmed as Fujir's answer to the problem of the dregs rolled over the horizon. A column of tanks had crested the hill and was crashing down the moonlit road, dust rising in plumes from their treads. Maybe Jesper hadn't got the Driscoll gate sealed, and maybe they had tanks waiting on the grounds. Given the firepower contained behind the ice court's walls, she supposed they could count themselves lucky. But it sure didn't feel that way. It wasn't until Inej and Wyland were thundering over the trestles of the bridge that Nina could make out what they were yelling. Get out of the way! They leaped from the path as the tank roared past them, then came to a gear-grinding stop. We have a tank, marvelled Nina. Kaz, you creepy little genius. The plan worked. You got us a tank. They got us a tank. We have one, Matthias said, then pointed at the horde of metal and smoke bearing down on them. They have a lot more. Yeah, but you know what they don't have. Kaz asked Jesper, rotated the tank's giant gun. A bridge. A metallic shriek went up from the armoured insides of the tank. Then a violent bone-shaking boom sounded. Nina heard a high whistling as something shot through the air past them and collided with the bridge. The first two trestles exploded into flame, sparks and timber plummeting in the gorge below. The big gun fired again. With a groan, the trestles collapsed completely. If the Fujirns wanted to cross the gorge, they were going to have to fly. We have a tank and a moat, said Nina. Climb on, crowed Wyland. They boosted themselves on the insides of the tank, clutching at any groove or lip in the metal for dear life, and then they were rolling down the road towards the harbour at top speed. As they roared past the street lamps, people emerged from their houses to see what was happening. Nina tried to imagine what their wild crew must look like to these Fijians. What did these see as they poked their heads out of the windows and doorways? A group of hooting kids clinging to a tank painted with the Fijian flag and charging along like some deranged float gone astray from its parade. A girl in purple silk and a boy with red gold curls poking out from behind the guns. 4 soaked people holding tight to the sides for their dear life. A shoe boy in prison clothes. 2 bedraggled Driscoll and Nina, a half-naked girl in shreds of teal chiffon, shouting, "We have a moat!" When they entered the town, Matthias called, "Wyland, tell Jesper to keep the western streets." Wyland ducked down and the tank veered west. "It's the warehouse district," Matthias explained, "deserted at night." The tank clattered and clambered all over the cobblestones, swinging right and left over curbs and back again to avoid the few pedestrians. Then sped into the harbour district, past taverns and shops and shipping offices. Kuei tilted his head back, his face bright with joy. "I can smell the sea," he said happily. Nina could smell it too. The lighthouse gleamed in the distance. 2 more blocks and they'd be at the quay and freedom. 30 million krug. With her share and Matthias's, they could go anywhere they wanted, live any life they chose. "Almost there," cried Wylam. They rounded a corner, and Nina's stomach dropped. "Stop!" she shouted. "Stop!" She needn't have bothered. The tank jolted to a halt, nearly flinging Nina from her perch. The quay lay directly before them, and beyond it the harbour, the flags of the 1,000 ships snapping in the breeze. The hour was late. The quay should have been empty. Instead, it was crowded with troops, row after row of them in grey uniforms. 200 soldiers at least, and every barrel of every gun was pointed directly at them. Nina could still hear the bells of the elder clock. She looked over her shoulder. The ice court loomed over the harbour, perched on the cliff like a sullen girl with feathers. "What is this?" Wyland asked Matthias. "You never said—" They must have changed the deployment procedure. Everything else was the same. "I've never seen Black Protocol engage," Matthias growled. "Maybe they always had troops stationed in the harbour. I don't know." "Be quiet," Inej said. "Just stop." Nina jumped as a voice echoed over the crowd. It first spoke in Fijian, then Ravkan, then Kerch, and finally Shu. "Release the prisoner, Kuei Yubul. Put down your weapons and step away from the tank." "They can't just open fire," said Matthias. "They won't risk hurting Kuei." Excuse me. "They don't have to," said Nina. "Look." An emancipated prisoner was being led through the rows of soldiers. His hair was matted to his forehead. He wore a ragged red kefta and was clutching the sleeve of the guard closest to him, lips moving feverishly as imparting some desperate wisdom. Nina knew he was begging for a parem. Excuse me. "A heart render," Matthias said grimly. "But he's so far away," protested Wylam. Nina shook her head. "It won't matter. Had they kept him down here without whatever the troops were posted in the lower Jurham? Why not? He was a weapon better than any gun or tank." "I can see the Ferroland," murmured Inej. She pointed down the docks a little way off. Jesper could shoot the Heartrender. They could try barreling through the troops with the tank, but they would never make it to the ship. The Fijians would gladly risk Kuei's life before they ever let him fall into anyone else's hands. "Kaz," Jesper called from inside the tank. This will be a really good time to say you saw this coming. Kaz looked out over the sea of shot soldiers. I didn't see this coming. Looks like you were right, Helva. The words were for Matthias, but his eyes were on Inej. I've had my fill of captivity, she said. They won't take me alive. Me neither, said Wylan. Jesper snorted from inside the tank. We really need to get him more suitable friends. Better to go out with fists swinging than let some Fijian put me on a pike, said Kaz. Matthias nodded. Then we agree. We end this here. No, Nina whispered. They all turned to her. The voice echoed out from the Fijian ranks one more. You have a count of 10 to comply. I repeat, release the prisoner Kuei Bull and surrender yourselves. 10. Nina spoke to Kuei rapidly in Shu. You don't understand, he replied. A single dose. I understand, she said. But the others didn't, not until they saw Kuei produce a little leather pouch from his pocket. Its rim was stained with a rust-coloured powder. No, Matthias shouted. He grabbed for the parem, but Nina was faster. The Fijian voice droned on. 7. Nina, don't be stupid, said Inej. You've seen... Some people don't get addicted after the first dose. It isn't worth the risk. 6. Kaz is out of tricks. She plucked open the pouch, but I'm not. Nina, please, Matthias begged. She'd seen the same anguish on his face that day in Elling, when he thought she'd betrayed him. In a way, she was doing the same thing now, abandoning him once more. 5. The first dose was the strongest. Wasn't that what they'd said? The high and the power could never be replicated. She'd be chasing it for the rest of her life. Or maybe she'd be stronger than the drug. 4. She touched Matthias's cheek briefly. If it gets bad, find another way to end it, Helva. I'm trusting you to do the right thing, she smiled. Again. 3. Then she tossed her head back and poured the parem into her mouth, downing it in a single hard swallow. It had the sweet, burnt taste of the Gerudo blossoms, she knew, but there was another flavour too, one she couldn't quite identify. She stopped thinking. Her blood began to thrum and her heart was suddenly pounding. The world broke up into tiny flashes of light. She could see the true colour of Matthias's eyes, pure blue beneath the flecks of grey and brown she'd put there. The moonlight gleaming off of every hair on his head. She saw the sweat on Kaz's brow, the nearly invisible pinpricks of the tattoo on his forearm. She looked out over the lines of the Fijian soldiers. She could hear the hearts pounding. She could see their neurons firing, feel their impulses forming. Everything made sense. Their bodies were a map of cells, 1,000 equations, solved by the second, by the millisecond, and she knew only answers. Nina, Matthias whispers. Move, Nina said, as she saw her voice in the air. She sensed the heart tremor in the crowd, the movement of his throat as he swallowed his dough. He would be the first. And then that leaves us on chapter 41. So I hope you are all having a lovely day, and I will see you next Monday where we hopefully might actually finish Six of Crows. So see you all then.